For this show, we have two very talented guests, Ian Mackay and Guy Picciotto from Fugazi, a music group residing in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
What does Fugazi mean, and how did you choose it?
All right, welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about music documentaries. I'm Dave Lizabram, here with my co-host,
Andrew Keats.
And we are, as always, brought to you by treblezine.com. They've been writing about music for like 20 years, so if you like music and writing, they do that, and they're good at it, and we appreciate it. I'm going to point you to their piece, Celebrate the Catalog, Fugazi, where friend of the podcast, Jeff Terich, kind of reviewed the whole Fugazi catalog. Now, this was back in 2011, but sad to say, Fugazi has not dropped a Guided by Voices or King Gizzard level of quantity of material since then, so it's still fresh. We'll link that in the show notes, but it's a good review for those who want to catch up or remember some Fugazi, remember some guys. We are here with Vish Khanna, the host of Kreative Kontrol. And I'm a big fan of your show. We like your show. We appreciate you coming on. First of all, why don't you just say hi?
Hey, thanks for having me, Dave, Andy. It's nice to see you, and I appreciate the kind words. It's great to be here.
So let's see. Typically, when we have a guest on, we invite them to pick a documentary that they would want to speak about. You selected Instrument, which is a film about the band Fugazi. It's directed by Jem Cohen, released 1999, and sort of unique to this Rock Docs project. I would say you went above and beyond. Now, I'm not going to just attribute it only to this, but it just so happens that you as we're recording recently on your show Kreative Kontrol, released an episode about this documentary where you had, as I recall, the director and most of the members of Fugazi on.
Everybody.
Was all four of them? Yeah, was it all four of them? Yeah, okay, right. It was hard to hear all, like 5 voices, 6 voices on a podcast, but and I was tracking it. But yeah, so I would say that has not happened. I mean, we recorded an episode with recently about the history of the Eagles documentary, and unfortunately nobody
no one called Don Henley.
Yeah. So but first of all, just credit to you for really really going the extra mile.
Yeah, I actually want to credit you guys, and I vaguely did in the intro to that episode. I regret not citing your name, the show name, but I would not have been spurred on to bring that group of people together had you not invited me onto your show. And so just so people understand, I get the email, do you want to be on the show? If so, what do you want to pick? I say, oh, well, and you're very helpful. You sent a list of things that have already been covered. It's great. So then I say, well, what about Instrument by Fugazi? You say, yes. I do some initial Googling because I just hadn't thought about the film in a while. Oh, it's the 25th anniversary of the release. That's interesting in itself. That's fascinating that you send me an email and I think of that movie and it's a milestone year, whatever that means, anniversaries, whatever. It's sort of random. Anyway, as it happens, I run into Guy and Ian and I say, I'm supposed to do this thing. And I thought one way to do some research would be to talk to you guys about the movie before I go on this podcast. I don't want to look like a horse's ass and not know what the hell I'm talking about. So can you make time to talk about it? And, it took some finagling and email threads and Ian calling me and all that kind of thing. And we figured it out. And everyone from the band agreed to be on the show with Jem. Jem also has a busy schedule. Everyone's very busy, but it worked out. And that ended up being, it's the 25th anniversary of Instrument. And I had a 900th episode coming up. And I thought, well, again, these markers, what do they really mean? These milestones. But I like to make the round as I enter a new podcast century. I like to make the round numbers special. And I was like, what could be more special than this for me as a lifelong Fugazi fan? And, I love those guys and we've become friendly. So it just felt nice to do it. So this was a long way of saying thank you for making me do some homework that ended up being very, very fun so that I could prep to be on your show. I will say I've retained nothing. I come on your show. I don't remember what I'm going to say. I have no plan about what we're going to say. I'm just going to we'll have a talk about it. But anyway, yes, thank
Yeah.
you for the invite. It really caused some nice stuff. By the way, those guys, I think, were happy to see each other. The Fugazi guys don't get to hang out very much because everyone's so busy. So I think they just enjoyed the hang. Again, you guys cause good. You create
Wait,
joy in the world. So thank you.
not only that, the two guys with the least amount of punk credibility in the entire world were responsible for, in some sense, the reunion of Fugazi. I mean, it just,
it's
really,
true.
there should be a rock doc about that.
You mentioned that this was all prefaced by a discussion about the Eagles.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
we should,
Exactly.
I'll retract some of my compliments. No, I'm kidding. No, thank you. I really mean it. It's funny
Well,
how
it's-
life works. You send me an email and this chain of events occurs, and I owe it to you. So thank you.
Okay.
Well, we're always looking for sort of like a sort of viewing companions for each of these episodes. It's always nice to have a little bit of extra content so you can bring in a little bit more than just our own observations from the movie. And I would say that what you put together is the best viewing companion of any of the shows we've done. It
Oh,
couldn't
thank
have
you.
been more in line with what, I mean, it was everybody involved with the film talking about the film. So there's some real great nuggets in there. And, for anybody from the DVD era, that your piece feels like a bonus feature that
Yes.
could be on the DVD. The
Yes,
DVD
I've
box,
heard that from others, and I miss those features myself.
Me too.
We have a family movie night in my house, and we watch things primarily on streaming. And but every once in a while, I'll pull out my Blu-rays and DVDs for some Hitchcock thing or whatever I pick. We all pick. Everyone in the four members of my family, we alternate. So yeah, I miss the features, and yeah, that's a good call. I've heard this from others. It didn't occur to me while it was happening that this was
Yeah.
like a director's commentary, but yeah, you're right. It kind of harkens back to that, I think, much missed time where we got
Oh, yeah.
that kind of insight. Yeah.
Those things I may have mentioned this on the show before. To me, in that era, pre-podcast, those were like the proto podcasts, the director's
Yes.
commentaries.
Yes.
That's like how I wired my brain to be ready for podcasts when that medium was created.
Yeah,
Right.
that's true. A lot of, I mean, making of feature. Yeah, podcasts are funny. I mean, even to this day, like it is the name of a medium we use, but it's really, yeah, they're interviews, they're informal conversations. They're meant to be real behind the scenes kind of frank discussion. So yeah, there's a tradition of that's true. Yeah, I just hadn't thought of commentaries like that. I guess really are among the prototypical sort of discussion groups for stuff like what we're doing today and what a lot of people are consuming. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, after doing like 98 episodes of this podcast, I now sort of understand what we're doing. We're sort of doing like a version of that. So, okay, we finally figured it out. Cool, we can wrap it up. All right, so let's talk. So we a lot of times when we start this, we do a little around the horn where we talk about everybody's connection with the band or how they, obviously if we're doing something like about the Beatles, it's not like when did you first hear about the Beatles, but I guess with Fugazi that does kind of apply a little bit, sort of everybody's connections be very different here, but Vish, maybe you want to start with how you first got connected with them or became a fan.
Yeah, it would have been in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, where I was consuming a lot of like music magazines and music journalism and fanzines. And I came of age. So, whatever, when the year punk broke or whatever, what was I? I was 13, 14 years old, like pretty amazing age to be like, oh, there's a whole other universe that I wasn't told about by the magazines and books I've been reading. I'd hear glimmers of it on the radio that there's a whole underground music scene. So you'd see the name. Well, I was aware of Minor Threat. I was aware of Fugazi or Ian MacKay's other prominent band, I suppose. I was certainly aware of them. But yeah, through exploring, getting to go to record stores and reading more music journalism and watching more music journalism on TV, you just would hear this name, Fugazi, and it was sort of spoken about. It was like a secret word or something. There were a few bands like this of the time for me that when I think back, it's just I keep seeing this name. What does it mean? And then, at some point I got I think it was a used CD copy of 13 songs, which is um, sort of a compilation of their first couple of releases. Saw them in '95 on the Red Medicine tour. Saw them 5 times in 1998 when they put out End Hits. I saw them in what did I see them? I saw them in Chicago, Detroit, Syracuse, New York, Rochester, New York, and Toronto, Ontario. So I did a little road trip. I'm from,
Nice.
for people who don't know, I'm from Ontario, Canada originally, currently based in Alberta. And then I saw them, I saw them again in Chicago. So I just saw them a bunch. And then in the early part of this century, which makes me, it sounds very old. I sound old when I say this, but in the early
Join the
part
club,
of,
bro.
yeah, in the early part of this century, I started to think about what I wanted to do with my life after graduating from school. And somewhere down the line, I became a freelance print journalist. And so I was starting to interview people on a, local and smaller scale. And at some point I was writing for alt weeklies, and in Canada we have a monthly music magazine called Exclaim. And what was happening is I would be doing these phoners and interviews with people, and they would be 30-40 minutes, maybe longer. And and they'd be for magazine pieces. And in those days they'd say, okay, we want an 800 word story about so and so, and you'd be like, okay. And then you do the interview for 45 minutes, and then you go to your editor and say, I did the interview. They say, got to move things around, that's now 100 words. I'm like, what? So what about all the other stuff? Like, I can barely get anything in 100 words. So what do I do with this extra material? It wasn't extra at the time, it was just like, oh my god, I spent 45 minutes on the phone or did an interview. And it occurred to me in 2004 or 5 that maybe I could be on college radio and then share the whole interview in that regard, like in that format, because at the time I didn't know what else there was to do. So yeah, my now wife, and I started a college radio show called the Mish Vish Interracial Morning Show,
Hmm.
and that was on CFRU in Guelph, Ontario. That's where I went to school. Anyway, that's where I started to do this sort of work, radio broadcasting, and that's where I more actively would interview members of Fugazi about various milestones. Now, by 2005, they were no longer an active band, but they are my favorite band. There's a list there with the Beatles and Shellac and No Means No and Pavement and Silver Jews and AC/DC, and I don't know. There's a long list of bands I would say are my favorites. But
We need the whole list. So.
yeah, I know. Sorry, Tribe Called Quest, Beastie Boys, whatever. Anyway, my point is, I really love them, and so whenever they had something archival or historical to talk about, or new projects to talk about, new bands, we would talk. So yeah, it was just us talking over and over again at my request, and me writing about them and interviewing them. And after a while, I became familiar to them. Oh, it's that guy from Canada who's always asking us to talk. And we developed a rapport. And at this point, I would say a friendship, because I don't know. I just have a thing that occurs sometimes where I have an interview with someone, but there's a connection made and we stay in touch, or we talk about other stuff after the interview. And so I can't really explain it, but I have developed a nice rapport with those guys. Um, and yeah, when Instrument came out, I got it right away. I got it on VHS tape. That's how it was initially released in 1999. Then when it came out on DVD, I got it on that format as well, and was mystified, but also just loved the film. As I reflect upon it, I never had there's nothing boring about it. There's nothing draggy about it. I just loved it. I found it very immersive and true to them. It was mysterious, like you learn things, but it was still enigmatic and mysterious. And they let the work speak for itself. And that's what I try to do as much as possible in this world where you have to constantly promote yourself in your work. Like, I just want, I want the work to speak for itself and not be a real personality, which maybe experts have told me is a hindrance to me becoming a more prominent person in this field. But I'm like, I don't want to be that guy. I just want to, yes, we're, you guys probably go through this too. Yes, we're involved, but it's really about the talk, or it's really about the interview subject or whatever. Anyway, I think a lot of my work ethic comes and approach to stuff comes from being immersed in their world and how they carry themselves in the world. Them and Steve Albini, just certain figures that I've come across that were the opposite, really the opposite of the rock stars I first admired growing up in the 80s and 90s, who I've come to realize there was more pretense there than I realized at the time. Again, 91, 92, 93, to be a teenager and be like, wait, what the hell? Like, you guys all have tricked me. Like, I feel like I've been tricked for my whole life, and that you don't have to be a preening rock star. You can just be a normal person and make great art. And so yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. I grew from someone who admired them to befriending them on some level and developing a communication correspondent kind of correspondence with them, and it continues to this day. That's kind of it.
Well, Andy, as our resident DC hardcore OG.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think I was pretty young in the early '90s when they were coming around. Their reputation preceded them when by the time I learned of them in the late '90s, early 2000s. It was getting to that age where you start to scratch the surface a little bit and look for another level of music. And I got a copy of 13 Songs in the early 2000s when I was in high school. Became a pretty big fan for somebody who otherwise wasn't really into punk or hardcore in any real way at that time. But I was into Fugazi. Fugazi was really the one band in that world that I listened to a lot in that time, and kind of just kept listening to them all through college. And then I do remember I picked up a copy of this movie at Soundgarden Records in Baltimore, Maryland. Shout out, one of the best record stores in the country. And had that all through the DVD era. Watched it a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Loved it. So it was actually really interesting going back to it. I haven't seen it in maybe 10 or 15 years, and seeing it through the context of now, this documentaries are so dime a dozen. And this having been so familiar with this movie during a time when there weren't so many of them, cast an interesting light on it. So we'll get into some of that stuff, but that was sort of my big takeaway on the most recent viewing.
Nice.
Andy, I don't think we ever talked about like coming from the DC metro area.
Yeah.
Like, but not being necessarily involved in that scene. Like, what did that Discord and all that stuff mean to people who are just generally interested in music?
It's actually very similar to like Go-Go in that like you're from the area and that there's this very particular scene that's happening in the city that even if you're not in it, there's a sense of regional pride, and like you just have to be aware that there is this unique thing that's from your area that like basically doesn't happen anywhere else. Go-Go certainly, just doesn't happen anywhere else. And Fugazi was sort of like that. So I remember folks who, like me, weren't into hardcore music really, nonetheless knew some of the mythos around Fugazi, and they get into this in the band, but that was certainly, or in the movie I should say, that was certainly in the air, was like different versions of what their political stances were sort of always floating around, and a lot of, frankly, misinformation or misrepresentations. I mean, I think the first thing I had ever heard of them was they've never charged for a concert. It's always free. And so, and it was like, that was before I'd heard a note. That was what my understanding of them was.
Yeah, it's interesting, the broken telephone with that band. Like it just, everyone has a theory or an idea of them, and some of that is reflected in the film as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Vish, I think you and I are roughly around the same age, and again, it's a band that I remember hearing about as a teenager, in that era, and I at some point I picked up really probably most or all their records, used or wherever I came across them or whatever. But was never like really went that deep. And I guess without turning this into like too much of a therapy session, it was a little bit of, um, I always felt like this band represented part of a scene that was like a party I wasn't invited to or something, which is like such a weird way to look at it. And or probably the opposite of what they would have wanted. And I'm not putting that on them or anybody. I mean, I think if I really think about it, like probably I was the asshole. So, I don't, I wouldn't blame anybody for not inviting me to the party. But you know, there was just like first of all, I just was never able to figure out like when these shows were happening or where or how you like I was living in San Diego, so it's not like I was a million miles from anywhere. Like there's I'm sure Fugazi must have played the Casbah or whatever, or Soma or something, or wherever else they played, and places that maybe I even went to from time to time. But again, it was like I was not in that Whisper network, and I somehow just did not figure out how to access things, and also like I feel like they foregrounded their ethics and have always done so in a way that, for me, I always respected it. But then I felt like, well, if I'm not doing everything they say, I shouldn't, like, I would be a hypocrite to participate or to attend.
Sure, yeah, I can appreciate that. I don't know that they've foregrounded their ethics as much as they just carry themselves in a certain way. I mean, I would,
Well, their
but I
public image was that way.
yeah, and but again, I mean, I think as covered in the movie, I think their public image was kind of ascribed to them from all over the place, and they are. I mean, one of the things I respect about them is for all the noise about them, they kind of quietly just did their work. They
Hmm.
quietly did. They set up the shows that I'm sorry you missed them, but they set up the shows as in a way that was as respectful to their audience and was as comfortable for them as possible. But when you're quiet, sometimes people want to make noise about you and talk about you and make presumptions about you in public. And I think I mean, that's a major lesson of the film to
Yeah,
me. They talk about it, but even when they talk about it, it's not to garner sympathy or what have you. It's simply a matter of fact, like
right,
people say this shit and we're just doing our work and
right,
we made the work as accessible as possible, like financially, economically, people are invited to come check it out. There's no barriers as far as we can tell, except on some level. I mean, one of the reasons so many bands and artists would jump ship to larger companies, labels, was because they thought, I want my records in as many record stores as possible, distribution. I don't know. When I was coming of age and going to independent record shops, first of all, it was a revelation to get to do that in my mid teens, like when we started to be able to drive, or before that, we would bike to the good record stores, and it wasn't easy, but we would get there, and there were Fugazi records for sale, and I remember that, and I think they were conscious of the distribution situation and worked with people that would get their records out there. So yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. Um,
I'm not putting anything on them, by the way. And when I
no,
say like they foregrounded their ethics, I mean like when I say they did, I mean again the
no,
broken telephone of
well,
what you hear when you're 18, right?
Yeah.
we're living through a weird time for this sentiment, right? Where people are very actively being like, the climate's changing, we should probably, I try to act accordingly and do my little part. There's a pandemic, I try to act accordingly and do my little part. But the majority of people are like, that's too hard. What you're saying, I appreciate or makes sense, or they say it doesn't make sense because they deny it, you know what I mean?
Right.
Good people will say, oh, okay, yeah, you're probably right, but I'm too busy, it's too hard, I'd rather just get my stuff from the one-stop shop, it's easier to do things this way. I think you might be speaking to some of that. Like
Totally.
viewed people view, I think, logic and decency with some manner of self-conscious derision because they don't feel like they can live up to whatever standard, or they think someone is being high and mighty by extolling virtue or living a certain way, and that makes them not only self-conscious but then angry, and they lash out and they say, you don't know what you're talking about, you're only charging $6 for your show, you're leaving money on the table, your records are affordable, you're leaving money on the table, don't you want to be selfish? Like there's this subtext.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think you're speaking to commentary I remember at the time and still to this day, when people want to deride that band or bands like it for making art the way they make art.
Yeah.
There's something more deep there about where they're coming from, and it should be, you sound like you're self-aware about it, and I think people should be a little more self-aware about, like, where is this anger or judgment. I think when people feel judged, they get judgy.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is
that's precisely what it is. That's precisely what it is.
Yeah,
The band, the story around the band could easily make you feel judged about whether you were ethically up to par
right.
to their standards.
Right. But what I would argue is that I never felt, and I've never felt from the band, that they were putting that across for anyone. It was just they carried themselves in a certain way. And I think to everyone's credit, I think people, we were talking about people sort of misunderstanding them, but I think people did get it. I think people understood how they were carrying themselves and behaving, but they also didn't get it. Like, they didn't get how that was possible. And there are many figures in our lifetime who've done this, where they get derided for speaking whatever truth, like the truth. The truth is very scary for some people, and now we're at a point where people are like, well, that's your truth and it's not my truth, but facts are facts. I'm on a bit of a soapbox here, but I think what you're talking about is very pervasive right now, where when people, again, they deride, I'll just pick out a few figures, but like Bernie Sanders, whoever, like Ralph Nader over the years, probably Michael Moore, like there's just people who sort of speak out, and there's enough people stomping on them for speaking out and saying things that some people are like, well, that's arguably true. And then it just becomes a thing that just becomes how they're perceived. And it's not true necessarily, but okay, guys, I've gone on a tangent.
No. This is what the band, I mean, part of what I like about this band is that they invited a conversation about ideas. And that I always felt that way. I never felt anything bad about any of these guys. Like, I never, when I've read an interview or saw them, I always thought they were intelligent and affectionate. I always liked the music.
Yeah.
Again, if there was a feeling of there's a, as much as they may have tried to react, if there was a feeling of these are in some sense the cool people who are in on this like whole Fugazi thing, for whatever reason, like that wasn't something that I don't know, whatever. I never made that connection.
Sure, yeah,
but that's purely a social thing. That's completely a matter of, is completely outside of, anything the band ever did.
No, it's your context. Mine, I was lucky. I mean,
I had plenty of other bands that I got into or things in art that I got into that I was. So, there's also only so many hours in the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I was on a different trip, but
sure.
Again, watching the film brought all these things back for me.
Well, one of the things that I think the movie makes clear, and maybe this is related to some of what we're batting around, is I think a dumb version of Fugazi could absolutely be the things that people were sometimes critical of them about, or critical to the idea of them about, like an unsophisticated set of ethics around a band that or an inarticulate version of some of the things that they thought could definitely make you roll your eyes and go, oh, okay, boy, we're just playing the greatest hits about commercialism. And then you hear them talk about it. You hear them actually say what it is they think they're doing, why it is important to them, to actually say the thing, as opposed to some vague idea of it that gets passed through a game of telephone. And you realize, oh, these guys are very smart. They're simply deliberate. You know, they're not necessarily being high and mighty to anybody. They're simply doing their art and their version of what they want to do in the way that they want to do it, and they have very clear eyes about how that is and why that is. And just the genuine article is so much more interesting and so much more intelligent than the easy caricature of it. And I think this movie puts that in perspective very, very well.
Yeah, there's a moment in the discussion that we had on my show where Guy's talking about this time period in the 90s where there was this feigned belligerence by bands to be like, you know, okay, so first of all, I like Nirvana. I know a lot about Nirvana. And that was a gateway for me as a kid. Like that, arguably, you know, that's kind of where I learned about that there could be an alternate way of thinking and an alternate kind of culture to you know, be immersed in. Kurt Cobain is on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine for the first time, and he's got on his shirt corporate, what is it, corporate magazines still
Corporate,
suck, or
yeah,
something.
yes.
So this like, you're on a major label, you are conflicted about that. You're on a corporate magazine, you're conflicted about that. In the face of that, you have a clip and instrument where Ian is seen to be saying, I have a lot of contempt for the music industry.
Yeah.
And the two things are similar sentiments, but you have one person who is living it, who's actually backing up what he's saying by not being a part of the music industry. And you have another more, you know, obviously more tortured soul who is saying, I don't want to be a part of this thing that I work so hard to be a part of.
Yes.
Now that I've got it, I don't want it, which was very confusing as a teen, because you're like, the best case scenario you could make was they were using the system against the system.
Right.
And on some level, that is where Kurt's, like, again, I don't mean to paraphrase Guy, but Kurt's feigned belligerence, I think he used for good. Like, I think he used his position for good ultimately. When I say he had feigned belligerence, I think he was conflicted, but he used his platforms to raise the profile of people he thought were being marginalized or had inspired and influenced him. And on some level, I think, and marginalized communities culturally, made a point of speaking out for minorities and LGBTQ people at the time. And that is the best case scenario for someone like that. Like that's about the best we could hope for someone to achieve. I'm sure at this day and age, someone would argue with me about his motivations and all that kind of stuff, but I think he did the best he could to enhance his community, his far-reaching artistic and cultural community. But I go back to what I'm saying. The thing is, Ian in that clip is saying something, and you can't argue against that. Guy does have contempt for the music industry.
Yeah.
And his way of dealing with that is to work sort of around it, but still work in the same field or realm, if you will. Whereas Kurt sort of, or people like Kurt and a lot of bands were like, yeah, this fucking major labels, they suck, but I'm going to work with them.
Sure.
I mean, you know, arguably Rage Against the Machine, I always found a very confusing, like, you know, maybe in an ethos way, you'd be like, oh yeah, they seem to have a similar viewpoint to a lot of underground punk bands, but they are working on a major label and working and playing, you know, major corporate television events and all that kind of stuff. So what's going on? I mean, again, they're using those platforms to be subversive, but they're still taking the money, and they're still so. Sorry, I'm tangent man today, but that is my. I think this is maybe germane to what you were saying, Andy.
It totally is.
Yeah,
it totally is.
Totally. Yeah. I think also, like Pearl Jam and Eddie Vedder and their fights with like Ticketmaster. He's and he, you know, he counts himself as a huge Fugazi fan.
Yeah,
and then like there's the same level of you know, conflicted, even confusion, a confusion that honestly like Fugazi doesn't have.
Yeah.
You know, right? And like I think there's like a you know, he says, I think in the that interview that's part of the movie with the high school morning show.
Grade 8 actually. So
Great. Yeah.
junior high, is that what you
Yeah.
guys have? Junior
Okay, it was
high?
a junior. Yeah. That was
Yeah.
where he says, to exist outside the mainstream is a political act or a
Yeah.
political feat, he says.
Yeah.
And he also sort of says, if you don't want to be a part of something, you do it yourself.
Yeah.
And like that's not even, it's not even, he's not flowery about it. He's barely even political about it. He's just saying, if you don't want to do it, you don't do it. You make it yourself over here.
And I think that it's impossible to talk about this and not include Jem Cohen and his filmmaking in this conversation. I mean, obviously we're here to talk about instrument, but Jem's approach to filmmaking is the same ethos.
Yeah.
It's the same attitude. And that is clear to me. Like at that point in 1999, as you can probably tell, I was a music and culture. What did my friends used to jokingly call me, the king of pop culture, because I just seemed to know everything about TV and movies and music, and comedy was a big thing for me. I mean, I think one of the reasons the guys in Fugazi and I get along so well is because early on we would laugh. It wasn't all like, you guys are really serious people and I'm a very
Right.
serious person. We would go for jokes and we would laugh and chuckle. And so yeah, I don't know where I was going with this. Oh, yes, I do. Jem, I think, was looking at the culture of filmmaking at the time and music videos at the time, and didn't want to be a part of it. And he was using the same kinds of tools, the same cameras and films that some of these people were using, but obviously had his own vision and his own aesthetic. And it sort of flies in the face of what was going on at the time. So by this point in 1999, I'm watching Instrument, having seen probably every music documentary I could get my hands on, and they were all kind of the same in retrospect. The guy talking to the person talking to the camera, and you don't see the interviewer, and you live clips and sometimes reenactments of what they're talking about because there wasn't any footage.
Guy sitting by a big mixing board.
Yeah, guy sitting by a big mixing board. Then you see Instrument, and you're like, this is more immersive. This feels more intimate than anything else. And it's sort of distorted and murky, and things aren't over explained, but it all makes sense to me. Like I feel like I'm being it sort of has this verite quality where I feel like I'm just being dropped into conversations or dropped into different venues. I'm traveling along with them with very little mediation. And I think Jem is also Jem and Guy and all of them who edited the film, the band. I think we're speaking to something in that regard too, of how to actually present yourself. However self-conscious they were, it was as authentic a way of presenting yourself and depicting something as possible. So I think that this configuration of Jem Cohen and Fugazi making a film together is why it's so magical.
Yeah.
Because I think they were coming from the same social place, but they were also coming, I think, from the same. You invoked politics, I think, a moment ago. I think it was Andy. Guy's comment about to make things in a certain way is a political act. To work a certain way is a political act. I totally agree. So in a sense, they made a movie outside of society at the time, and it still resonates. I think that speaks to something too. Like, you watch some of these documentaries are completely dated. They look shitty. They use all these sort of schlocky, sticky, boilerplate things. This movie doesn't do that. And I didn't say that to them at the time that we were talking, but I think that band, by just doing things their own way, whether they meant to or not, their music and this film has this inherent timelessness.
Yeah.
That's an achievement in itself, to do something like this and have a document and not have it look like it's exactly from one specific time period and was just cottoning on to all the methods that were being used. Like, that's magical in itself. Truly an innovative and independent way of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, Andy and I have a lot of affection for the tropes of the music documentary.
Sure.
We'd have to be able to tolerate a lot of that in order to watch as
Yeah,
many of
of
these as we
course.
do. And so yeah, and you can point those out and say when they're done well and when they're not done well and whatever. I mean, but this documentary is operating on a different level, I would say. I mean, I guess we really haven't set the scene too much.
Yeah, we
But for people who haven't seen it after all this, it's sort of a collage of there's it's almost 2 hours, and it's maybe an hour or more of that is music, live performance by the band. There's a lot of that, and they don't tell you. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times it's not really clear. Even like the sequence of events, it's not like you start in 1989 and they go to like it just kind of is whatever fits in the vibe. And then some kind of interviews with the band, not really sitting down like in a studio, but just as they're either in the recording studio or just kind of on tour around. There's clips from this, like you said, uh, junior high or grade 8 young woman who's interviewing Ian and Guy
Yeah.
for a school like project kind of thing, which is like a school TV, which is so charming and wonderful, and it's such a great. I mean, when you guys talked about that was just so great. And then so there's clips that were filmed by Jem, and then clips that were just pulled from whatever archives they had and stuff they found from other fans and things like that. And it all really flows together. Just like watching all these documentaries, you really get a sense of the artistry of editing.
Yeah.
Meaning, you can take all these different things filmed by different people. It's not like, okay, whoever, name a director, goes and makes a movie and like they like, select the lighting and the camera and everything, right? It's not like that kind of thing. You're taking all these different elements and assembling them, and
Yeah.
to make it feel coherent, and all flow together. Like when it's not done well, you could tell. When it's done well, it almost seems obvious or it's easy. But just a couple things that kind of jumped out that like kind of along with the lines of what you're saying of what they're foregrounding. I mean, when you see the live footage, I mean, first of all, Ian and Guy, it's not that they're trained dancers, but they really do express themselves through dance
Yeah.
really well and are very talented at that. I mean, these are all the elements of performance, right? And it's, and Guy is, and we've kind of talked about this a lot about documentaries about, you know, figures that are outside of the mainstream. I mean, Guy really is at this time a glamorous rock and roll frontman. I mean,
Yeah.
like that is not deniable. That he doesn't like sing like whatever. I don't know, some like a singer you might hear on the radio necessarily, but like the way he poses and presents himself and dresses is very cool.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any kind of conflict around that. Ian presents himself as much more of a like regular working kind of guy, and it is that conflict is a little bit interesting.
Conflict.
And
Huh.
or I don't know if conflict's the right word, but like juxtaposition.
Juxtaposition. Sure.
Um
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Andy, you alluded to Go-Go.
Hmm.
And I feel like those guys, I know
I
James
I'm
Brown
I
is a
would
big,
be willing to bet that these guys love Go Go.
they did, and they
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
And I think that scene totally, I don't
Hmm.
want to speak on
Hmm.
their behalf, but my sense is that Go-Go and I think probably James Brown
Hmm.
footage, I still have a sense memory of seeing Fugazi in Detroit, and I was lucky to be on the side stage watching them and watching Yi, and like his, you're absolutely correct, Dave. Like he's a very influential and inspiring front man, if you will, like a guitar playing, singing guy who, when he puts his guitar down, uh, he's mesmerizing to watch. Absolutely, and but it's a feeling. Like it's not. I don't. I guess what I'll say is, I don't feel like it's contrived. I think when the spirit would hit them. It's funny. I saw them back to back in New York State in '98, and I can't remember. One show was in Rochester, and one show was in Syracuse. And I may have which city. I might have the cities wrong here, so forgive me. But I will say the first night I saw them, which I think was in Rochester, was a sedate audience.
Hmm.
We were, it was a smaller club, and people were kind of into it, but it wasn't like fiery. The next night, there was this cohort of guys who Ian addressed them at one point, and they said they were from Bath, New York. They traveled into the show, and they were causing a commotion during the show. The intensity level was up. I think it's the only time I saw Fugazi where they had to say, "Look," they kind of were famous for checking in on everyone when things were getting a little unruly and saying, "Look, settle down a little. Like, people are getting hurt. You don't have to be a jerk to enjoy the show, ostensibly." And that show was one of those shows. And the intensity level from the sort of rage they were experiencing at these dudes causing problems manifested itself on stage. When Guy put his guitar down that night, I believe they did Glue Man, if my memory serves, which, as they talked about in our conversation, was a song that had to come out when would come out on it would make it onto the into the show when they were feeling a certain thing, a certain level of intensity. And I'm pretty sure, if memory serves, and luckily with Fugazi you can check, you can check the archives. The intensity of the audience caused Guy to throw himself further into the show. Um, he was When he was performing, he was like nobody else. And Ian, in his own way, is very intense, but Ian never put his guitar down. Ian's guitar was always on him, because they started as a three-piece. When the Guy joined, as you guys know, probably when Guy joined the band, he wasn't even really in the band. He was like a backup singer. He didn't play guitar initially. That came later. So every once in a while, so the configuration was Ian MacKaye on guitar and vocals, Brendan Canty on drums, Joe Lally on bass. And that notion of Guy interchanging between guitar player Guy and freewheeling Guy was always it continued throughout the duration of the band's existence, and it made for a really dynamic show, because when he put his guitar down, you never knew what was going to happen. And so, yeah, I think Go James Brown, the audience, whatever the spirit in the room was, that would cause him to become this superhuman performer. And I've never seen it. He did a trick once on a mic stand in Detroit where, like, he balanced his back on it and then did a flip, a twist in the air. Like, I can't even explain it. I saw it and I was like, what the hell was that? It was like a magic trick. Yeah. So yeah, he threw himself into every performance. Well, and we talked once, everyone's always clamoring for Fugazi reunion stuff. And we talked once well after the band had been done. And he said, I was completely destroyed after every tour, after every show. Like, I wouldn't have my voice. My body was sort of destroyed. It hurt. It hurt him to be in Fugazi. And if you see footage of him playing, you can maybe understand why.
Yeah, there's something that a lot of the performances in this movie show, which is in line with what you're saying, that they sort of, you mentioned Go James Brown. You could even make comparisons to sort of improvisational music where Guy and Ian are sort of in conversation with each other, and it's outside of the structure of the song. There's sort of just a bed of a rhythm to it, and they can vamp on it. There's a particular scene where they're sort of shadowing each other on stage.
And Shut the Door, But I just to interject, I think, just to be clear, Brendan and Joe are definitely part of that conversation.
Yeah.
Because even if it seems like Ian and Guy, if you watch Shut the Door, the clip you're talking about, Brendan and Joe are improvising too. Joe, I think, is keeping an eye on Brendan, but that is I don't know. I don't want to be too precious about it, but I can't think of too many bands like that band where each member is contributing to any improvisation going on. It's not just like so and so went off and did something, so we got to keep an eye on them.
Lay a bed for this solo.
Yeah, lay a bed. It's not that to me. It is all very. You use the right. If I may say, I think you use the right term. They are conversing on stage musically.
Yeah, and I think in general that's not really a set of words that you often use around punk music, for better or worse, and that that just comes across very fully in the way that they use these. And it also, the visual style of the movie, which we haven't said, and I wouldn't have known the particulars of this if not for listening to your conversation with Jem, but he used Super 8 footage and then slowed it down, and it slowed down in a way that creates it's just a little bit unreal, and that slight unreality makes it incredibly compelling to watch.
Yeah.
And that one word that Jem used a lot in your discussion was impressionistic,
Hmm.
and it is in like in in the true like French impressionism period, where it provides the impression of a sunset. It
Yeah.
provides the impression of being in a dimly lit, dirty concert venue that without more accurately than just a video footage at proper speed with proper sound would. It better places you in the room by making it unreal.
I totally agree. That's a really great way of putting it. Frankly, like I think for all its distortion, if you will, of a real thing, it feels more real.
Hmm.
And that to me is a real remarkable feat of its filmmaking as well. So, and it has a lot to do with the tools he had access to at the time and the tools he chose to use. And then, I don't think he was begrudging about it, but eventually he got, I forget what it's called, a sound sync 16 millimeter. Is that what the right term? I can't remember. It's a camera that he was initially shooting a lot of the footage in silent movies, and then was getting a camera that had sound to it. And anyway, it's an interesting confluence of events. Like you have this person who wants to make subversive films. He's using different formats, and then you have this dub movie. You have this collage movie in the end of all these different formats and styles, because it's not all Jem's
Yeah.
camera work either. And yeah, somehow it's all very cohesive and personal and intimate. Like I feel like you say, you feel like you're there, even though it feels like a surreal place to be.
Yeah, it's one of the things about this movie that's, I mean, different from any other that I can think of, is that because the band participated in this, making of this art project. Um, i- I mean, I think even the title card says it's by Jem and Fugazi, if I'm not mistaken.
It
But
it, it totally is. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a total collaboration. Yeah,
so he filmed this footage silently of them playing, and then the band improvised instrumental music, or however they constructed it, created instrumental music as a soundtrack to those scenes.
yeah,
So it's not they're not like, oh, okay, this was when we were playing Waiting Room and we're going to play that song, right? It's like completely new original music, that to this manipulated footage that may have been filmed years before of them. And it's so wild, and I mean it's just so different from a documentary that we typically see, where there's an artist and then a director comes in and they just assemble a film around it, and the artist may sign off on it or participate in interviews or whatever, but they're not actively involved in the creation. And yeah, what it's just such a cool and it seems like, I mean, anybody could do this, right? Any band, or musician could do this. They just nobody's picked up on it.
I think you have two with Gem and Fugazi. You have two entities that are very diligent documenters.
Hmm.
So they document things, and so Fugazi, as far as I know, there's just hours and hours and hours of them recording themselves, not for any particular purpose, just to capture ideas and to be archivists on some level. I
I
know
would
that,
also add, I suspect it. I know Ian was a skateboarder.
yeah,
Like that's a very skateboarder thing to do,
Mm.
is
to
it?
just to film yourself all the time.
Yeah, that's fair. And I know that, I just want to be clear. Like I don't think it's a measure. It's not necessarily a signal of self-importance. I
Hmm.
think it's just like that's to
They're
to have
artists.
to have an
Yeah.
idea, to be a skateboarder and have an idea and capture it is to potentially learn from that.
Hmm.
To learn
Hmm.
from the idea, to capture the idea is to learn from the idea, I think. And I think Fugazi and Jem, I feel like philosophically they're capturing things because at some point you realize there might be a value that you don't want to into something that you don't necessarily want to lose to the sands of time or whatever. So you have two really diligent documenters working together, and that creates this treasure trove of material. And I think we're all really fortunate that they were diligent about that. But this
Hmm.
is important to us and then, hey, 10 years later, it's a good thing we captured that thing.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
now we can use it for this larger project. And it sort of happens. Or like he tells a story of just randomly running into the guy who happened to be in Philadelphia and filmed the now sort of infamous basketball sequence
Yeah.
where he's climbing through a basketball hoop, which has, in a way, kind of transcended the film. It's often used in memes and all that kind of stuff.
It is quite terrifying.
It
As an
looks,
adult with children or whatever, I'm
yeah,
like, Jesus
sure.
Christ, dude.
It's a little intense. It's very intense, and but the soundtrack is also fascinating to me. I was fascinated to hear them talk about how it's for them. It's for some of them, it's their favorite Fugazi release.
Mhm.
I have always loved it, and it has its own interesting life. Like what I forgot to mention or didn't forget, there was so much going on in our long discussion. But one fascinating aspect of the instrument soundtrack is that Rick Rubin actually tried to get Jay-Z to rap over an
Hmm.
instrument piece.
Oh, interesting.
I think it's closed caption. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a documentary. Has anyone pitched the Jay-Z documentary about the making of the Black Album?
Backstage, is that the one? Or no, the Black
No,
Album one, yeah.
the Jay-Z documentary that we are preparing to record soon is the about Backstage, which is
Oh,
the tour for
The
Hard
final
Knock
tour.
Life.
Oh.
Yeah,
Knock
right.
Life
The
tour.
Hard Knock
Yeah.
Life.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
Well, in
But
any
we'll get
case,
to it. We'll get to
yeah,
it.
Yeah.
but there's a documentary about the making of the Black Album, and there's a sequence where Rick Rubin is trying to
mm.
get Jay-Z to rap.
Oh,
I
that's
think
interesting.
early version of 99 Problems, maybe. It's the same session where he ends up recording 99 Problems, but we're just sort of introduced to, if I even remember correctly, in the film, the Jay-Z film, there's like a plane landing as you hear the Fugazi music, which in the instrument, there's lots of planes
Yeah.
that Jem captured. And I was
yes,
like, is this an overt nod? I might be
Yeah.
misremembering I might be forgetting how the Jay-Z documentary works. But anyway, that soundtrack has its own interesting life. They were joking about some of the songs being like their most popular songs, but
Yeah.
it's true. I'm So Tired
Yeah.
from Instrument is one of their most popular songs on streaming. So there's something
it is the second most streamed song that they have on streaming after only Waiting Room.
right. That's
It's amazing.
fascinating. There's a whole lot of fascinating stuff about Instrument. It obviously resonates with all sorts of people as a soundtrack and as a film. And I think that's a nice testament to their instincts and their impulses as a creative force. Jem, again, I want to stress Jem and Fugazi.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Bringing up the connection between Fugazi and in some senses R&B and rock and rap like we've talked about. I once saw Girl Talk mix together Waiting Room and the Rihanna song Rude Boy. And like, first of all, they're like essentially the same.
Oh.
It works perfectly.
Wow.
And it completely unlocked that concept, like whatever 15 years ago, whatever this was, like I was like, oh, this is like really fair. That's kind of was Girl Talk's genius, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
is to like unlock all these connections. But yeah, it really works. And anyway, so go ahead,
Yeah.
Andy.
Well, so something, I think this movie ends up in very unconventional ways hitting some otherwise conventional beats within a documentary, and they achieve some of the things that you expect and you want out of a documentary, but it comes through the back door. And for instance, one of them, and maybe the most interesting part of the movie, is when they're sort of having a discussion about why they would not want to be in a movie about themselves. That is in a movie about themselves that's on camera, and an on-camera discussion. And that could be so like staged and annoying, but in this case, of course, it's a hidden camera. We find
Secretly
out
filmed.
secretly filmed. Jem explains in your show that he simply put the camera down as if he had turned it off. The red light, he always found a way to
Covered in tape.
to cover his tape, cover the tape so people didn't know it was recording.
Yeah.
And he would just kind of turn the camera ever so slightly to
I will
make sure
say,
whoever was speaking was in film.
As knowledgeable as I think of myself as a Fugazi fan, I'd never heard this before. Like
I was wondering if they talked about it. Yeah,
I just
before that.
hadn't. I I think I texted Guy and I never got a response to that particular text about like, did I just miss this
Yeah.
in
Right.
the history of this? Like, I just had never heard this. And like I say, I mean, it could be I just missed their interview cycle. 99, I was in university, and if I think
Right.
back on that time, like I was reading as much as I could, but probably missed some things because I was busy. But anyway, I just had not heard that anecdote before, and Ian's interjections in our interview are so funny. I
Yeah.
think you taped it. I think you taped the light. It was. I at some point I say something like, "Wait a minute, Jem, you surreptitiously recorded that conversation?" And he's like, "No, I didn't." And then you hear it go, "Yes, he did."
Yes, he
And I just thought
That's
that was
great.
very funny, and
Yes.
it made me laugh in the moment. And clearly, it's funny. They have a funny dynamic, like a
Yeah.
funny, literally like it's a
Yeah.
humorous,
It's a
almost sibling-like dynamic. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, and there's a couple other shots like that. There's like a shot of them on the road that looks like it might also be surreptitiously filmed, or like or just the Gem was trying to be inconspicuous. And they're just not talking at all. They have like their head in their hands, and it's this 10-second clip that just
Oh, and
shows
when they're
Mhm.
eating.
when
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
eating
Yeah.
on the road, and it's just like a 10-second clip that shows like, oh right, the road is rigorous and exhausting, and sometimes you have no privacy,
Yeah.
so sometimes you eat a meal together in total silence, so just you can be alone with your thoughts. And it's like it conveys so much right there. Like another documentary just belabors over life on the road, and this it captures it all in that little clip.
Yeah, in a weird way, this was before I started touring as a musician myself, but I feel like I learned a lot about touring life just from watching that film,
Yeah.
and then reading interviews where I feel like in Michael Azarad's book "Our Band Could Be Your Life," Ian is
Yeah.
quoted. There's something about like Ian's tips for touring, and he's just like, drink a lot of water. And
Yeah.
that always sticks with me. Like even to this day, if I go to the grocery store, I'm always bringing like a bottle of water because I'm like, yeah, that is true. Like on long drives, my joke is whenever I start a tour or a long trip, I have a bag of almonds and a glass and a bottle of water, and it's very healthy. And then on the way back is just chips and bullshit, and I give up on the way back. Like that's my thing.
Yeah.
But I do think of drink a lot of water, and watching that film, just like it does give you a real. There's a very like I forgot to ask about this too. Like Guy, there's a very funny sequence of Guy punching a bag of chips.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yes,
just like
yes,
they
yes,
don't
yes,
have
yes.
this. Like it's just funny. It's a funny thing. It's nothing. There's maybe not too much to read into it, but that's a part of you stop. You make your stop, and they don't have what you want.
Yeah.
Kind of thing, and it
I
sucks.
actually I actually love both. There's a clip of them in a gas station, and there's a clip of them in a grocery store. And
Yeah.
it's just like, this is the first time I've been inside a 1997 grocery store
Yeah,
since
yeah, yeah.
1997.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Right. All
Um,
those things that are so like at the time quotidian, whatever, with the benefit of time
Yeah.
become interesting. And yeah, and that's part of what is cool about documentaries in general. It doesn't, any kind of documentary,
yes,
you get
yes.
that kind of stuff. Um, so another thing that like every single 100% of the time that this happens in a documentary, it's great, is interviews with fans.
Yeah.
I really feel like I'm sure all directors of rock docs are listening to this show an hour in, but nonetheless, please always interview the fans. It's never like, I don't know, from Heavy Metal Parking Lot on down, it's always good. And here, you really get, first of all, you get like,
Bittersweet Motel.
yeah, sure, of course, right, of course, yeah, the best.
This movie though, interesting discussion. Interviewing the audience.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily interviewing the fans.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you
This one
understand the
takes a
distinction?
different.
Yeah,
Yeah, it definitely does.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because it's not all like we love Fugazi, they're the best. It's more shit talking, and they talk about that in in your interview as well. But it is first of all, it just is such a throwback to a type of person that
Yes.
we all
yes.
grew up with, and maybe were or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it's just such a picture of a.
No one can decide whether they are the example of never selling out or the ultimate example of total sellouts.
Right.
Like there's a complete debate from clip to clip of what the audience thinks.
Well, it's an interesting meditation on what people are informed about
Right.
in terms of that band, right?
Yeah.
That's what I think is going on. Like some people clearly know the band and are coming to them to see them because they know them.
Yeah.
And then the other folks are not really sure who the band is and are
They have
making
their
this
own
kind of
ideas.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's all made possible because of the affordability of the show, right? Because like it was like whatever, $8 or something to go to a show, so it was within the range of most people who just wanted to do something that night.
yeah.
And obviously this is still a day when there's, we had cable, but there's somewhat limited entertainment choices and things to do relative to now. So, hey, there's a band playing and I can afford to go
Well,
was
again,
a very attractive proposition.
however distorted, for some reason that band, their reputation, whatever you thought it was, really preceded them.
Yeah.
And in any case, you I think there was this feeling that, oh, this band is significant. Whether I like them or not, I just keep hearing about them. There's something significant, and they're coming to my town, which
Yeah.
I'm sure for some people are like, most bands don't even come to my town. I'm gonna go. But then, as Jem and the band talk about, like, including all of them at the end is just fascinating. The ones
My
that slag them and the ones that,
yeah.
clearly know them.
My favorite of the audience clips is the woman holding a baby who says, "I heard about them on NPR a couple
Yeah.
years ago," which is just like,
Yeah.
it's just like so perfect.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, please cover that baby's ears. This is gonna be
That's
loud.
like so because that is such a Fugazi thing, right? Like that you've got the guy who's like, I go to a fucking hardcore show to jump around and
Yeah.
dance, and these PC assholes tell me I have to stop. And
Yeah.
then you also have a mom who's like, it was so interesting to hear their views on commercialism on NPR.
Yeah. It's a real cross section of thoughts and ideas. And that was a really interesting thing to be a part of when you went to see them. For
Yeah.
myself, like, it's not something that probably occurred to me too much. But I mean, the other thing I think sometimes, and I forget, like, I probably stand out to certain bands because my name is Vish. I'm not a white guy. I'm not a white person. And I'm deeply immersed in white culture, like a culture that is predominantly white. So I always felt welcomed
Yeah.
at in post hardcore and punk, and I never really thought about my difference. And I don't know. Again, I didn't overthink it at the time, but that is an interesting part of the documentary too. I mean, I don't know that there's a lot of visible minorities speaking in the audience section, but you do get this range of thoughts and
Yeah.
cultural backgrounds and people who just want the energy.
Yeah. There are the
Eh,
two girls wearing hajib.
yes,
That
that's true. And I'm
yeah.
not. It's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's not any grand commentary. It's
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
I think on some level I never thought about my difference at any show, least of all a Fugazi show. But
Mhm. Mhm.
in retrospect, it was probably there,
Sure.
and I
Sure.
just
Yeah.
didn't know about it. Yeah.
Right.
All right. What else do we have to say about this documentary? I mean, I think we kind of covered it. I think it's, there's not a lot of talking head content. Sometimes, there's more to kick around from that. But, I mean, the music's incredible. I don't think we've even talked enough
The music
about the
is
aesthetic value of this band. Like because they have a
it's
certain reputation. They,
I mean the one
the
thing I
fact
would
that they're just like incredible musicians,
Yeah.
I
yeah.
think sometimes gets, is just an add-on or left by the wayside. But you can come to them, not, not. I could imagine somebody who doesn't speak English or whatever, just listening to this and being like, "Yeah, this rocks. It's great."
They're
Yeah.
I mean, when I say they're my favorite band, that's what I mean. They were the biggest influence on. I mean, short of like, I started out as a drummer, so certainly Nirvana and Dave Grohl were big for me at the time, and Ringo Starr, like the people who got me to be these gateway people to the instrument. But as soon as I heard Fugazi, like, it's almost a joke among my friends. Like, I was copying Brendan Canty
Mhm.
drum
Right.
stuff, and that also opened up the instrument because he
Mhm.
played with such swing and such intensity and ferocity, but swing, that yeah, they're the best band. Like, musically, I think they're also the best band. And it's also a marker of trying to figure the instruments out yourself and doing something unique with something that so many people use. Yeah, I mean, again, if I think about it, it's called instrument, and I've never really dwelled on it before, but we all are given these instruments
Mhm.
Right.
to make what they're all the same. everyone in the world gets the same kind of, it's a guitar, it's a drum kit, it's a camera,
or your voice,
or your voice, or a recording studio, but you can do something unique with it if you strive for that. If you trust yourself and you trust your instincts and your aesthetic impulses. And so again, I don't know why they chose instrument, but I think it's a very inspiring word in this regard, in the context of that band. It's like, we just took the tools that we were given and made something totally different with them.
Yeah.
That's possible.
Yeah. I took it to be an expression of that this was a product of the band.
Yeah.
We're using this movie not as a promotional vehicle, but as an artistic product we want to create. And I would say that that's probably one of the last things I want to say about the movie is just that more than many others, this movie stands on its own as a just a wonderful film that you could watch in one sitting. The music is great, the visuals are incredible. Yeah, you some of the stuff that you expect out of a documentary, learn about the band, have some basic Wikipedia-esque knowledge about where they came from and what they do. But more than that, this is like sort of an art film that I think you want to just sit and enjoy it at through the screening.
Yeah, my only regret about my immersion in this film is that I've never been able to see it in a theater.
Yeah, I'd love to see it in a theater.
I have a home theater, but it's not the same.
Right.
I wish they just, as we're speaking, they just did a screening in New York, and the Paris Theater in New York, I think, and Guy and Jem did a Q&A.
Awesome.
That was just before our discussion was released. We had done the discussion, so hopefully our discussion helped get some gears turning in their minds about the film again. But I wish, I'm jealous that I've never seen it in a theater, in a movie theater. I think that would be truly the best way to see it.
Well, when we do the first annual Rock Docs Film Festival, week-long extravaganza in Telluride or something, we'll invite you, and you can introduce the screening of this.
Oh, that would be lovely.
Which I'm sure is going to happen at any time. Tickets are $8, of course. So somehow we'll make it work.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Dave. I'm gonna hold you to that invitation.
Yes. There's one thing I wanted to ask you that's not about this film, but before we go, when we were starting this project some years ago, Rock Docs, there was obviously a list that we were kicking around or discussing of people that we would love to speak to, who sometimes pop up in these movies, or related to them. One of them, who of course was never to be, was Steve Albini, who you had a long-standing relationship with. It seems like as a friend, certainly as somebody who appeared on your show a lot. I've listened to everything you've said to, with, and about him that I could find. So I'm not sure, maybe you have other things to say, but it's been several months. I just wanted to kind of, first of all, just take a moment to kind of shout that out, but also, give you the opportunity to say, for us, in addition to the work he did as a musician and whatever, he did pop up in our world in this little corner a lot and always had interesting things to say. And anyway, I don't know if there's anything you want to say about him that you haven't said, but I think that the work, giving him the opportunity or whatever to speak so much and to have those dialogues with him is really valuable, and I'm glad they exist.
Well, thank you for saying that. I'm still sort of reeling from his loss, and I'm not alone in that, which is sort of comforting. I will say I was invited to attend a memorial gathering for Steve in Illinois in July, and that was really helpful. Grieving is always difficult. It's also for those of us who get immersed in an artist, like someone you don't really know, but you feel like you really, really know, like because they express themselves in their work in a very I don't know, ideally in a very deep and subconscious way. Like you're sort of learning more about them from a song maybe than their cousins know them somehow. Like
Right.
I often feel like I know some of these people in a more intimate way than I know some of my relatives, just because I've spent so much time thinking about the things they've said, either in their work or in in interviews or whatever. So yeah, I don't know exactly what to say except we miss him. And among the people at the gathering were Guy, Ian, and Joe were able to make it, so we hung out. That's actually where I pitched. I forget who I'd broached. Oh, I'd broached the idea of doing an instrument panel with Brendan and Joe when I saw them in Ontario the week before. They were playing a music festival at the Hillside Festival in Guelph, Ontario. So I talked about it, and Brendan said, "Oh, let me think about it." And I think he was just trying to imagine what this gathering would consist of. But at the Hillside Festival, we did a tribute to Steve. We played a shellac song. I got to play with them, which is
Hmm.
Jesus Christ. Like I don't even know what the hell.
Yeah.
Sometimes my own audacity. I think back on what I've asked people to take part in or what I've initiated. I'm like, where the hell do you get off even asking these people to do it? But we did it, and it turned out really, really. I'm happy with what it was filmed and all that kind of stuff. The performance was filmed, and so we had a connection there. And then before they left, I said I kind of want to do. I got asked to be on this Rock Docs pod, and I chose instrument. Can we do a panel? Anyway, I planted the seeds. Then the next weekend I see Ian and Guy and Joe, but I saw Ian and Guy, and I said, Ian, I want to do this thing, and he said, oh yeah, I'll do that. And in a weird way, we were all connected by Steve. Like these are all things that Steve. So earlier I said you guys initiated all of this activity for me, but
we're not taking that back.
In a weird way, so much of like the thing that really hurts about Steve is he was this connector, and he would spur people to his work, and his vision and his encouragement would inspire people to do things. This is a very, very sad circumstance, but Steve's loss connected me. I just feel a bit more connected to the Fugazi guys because we had this experience paying tribute to Steve on stage by playing one of his songs, and then I had the most time I've ever spent with them in person, Guy and Ian in particular. We had 4 days together to hang out and talk. I didn't see Ian as much because I think everyone wants to talk to Ian and he's moving around, but Guy and I spent a lot of time together, and it was because of Steve. And so that's just a little slice that I'm trying to. There's more to say about Steve, but in this context about instrument and your question, like Steve hovers over this too. Steve hovers over us having this conversation, you guys and me right now, and he is part of the reason why though Fugazi. I think, I've tried to be very careful about not tooting my horn that everyone in Fugazi was just on my show, because they don't, from what I understand, they don't do that stuff very often. But I do think Ian, me, Guy, and Joe being together in person also prompted that to happen. I wasn't just wasn't just an email. It was like, can we do this? Like, I have an idea. And I'll arrange it all. And because we had this face to face because of Steve, yeah, he's just been this force in my life forever. Like this show that I do people want to be on the show because Steve is on the show. Yeah. Absolutely. Like people give me time because of Steve. I know this for a fact. And so I owe him so much. There are certain people I just owe a lot of my whatever success I might have. Like it's because of people like him, and they inspire me to do the work. To work, like to try to do the work and not worry too much about yourself somehow. and it is sort of community work, like you guys. Like I'm always talking, or I'm always trying to enhance a culture. You're doing your best to kind of further the culture along. You don't want these rock documentaries to fall by the wayside and people to forget about them, so you've started a show. I want these days, like I don't even know who's doing as many. I do music interviews and culture interviews constantly, and meanwhile other people are folding that tent up and not doing them anymore. So yeah, those guys, the Fugazi people and Steve, are about communication and discourse as much as they are about making stuff. And I think I'm in that same realm, and I think you guys are in the same realm. So that is my long-winded way of saying we wouldn't be here. You and us three wouldn't be here right now if it wasn't for Steve, in a way. I certainly wouldn't know as much about instrument if it wasn't for Steve, in a way. So, yeah, I'm not someone who's like, it's fate. But I do think there's a weird chain reaction that all of it is, in a weird way, everything we're doing right now, us three, for me, starts with a relationship I fostered with Steve. And I just miss him, but I'm trying to live up to the bargain by, the gauntlet he laid down to do good work and be respectful and champion the people who deserve it the most as much as I can. And I think if anything, I have that ethos from people like him and people like Fugazi and people like Jem Cohen. So I stand before you, some sort of amalgamated man, full of thoughts and inspirations from folks like that.
Thank you for sharing that. We really appreciate it.
I didn't know where I was going with that. I hope it was coherent.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And
landed the plane.
I deeply regret that we never made the effort to reach out and let Steve say no thanks or whatever, or maybe say yes or whatever. But you're sharing that made it, gave us a little bit of that connection. I do appreciate that. So
you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't. Sometimes at the end we're like, "Do you recommend this movie?" But I think we can probably skip that formality in this case. Yeah. I think we enjoy this film and think it has a lot to recommend itself. Even if you're not a punk rock lifer like me and Andy, or whatever, it's really just an awesome piece of filmmaking. Andy, would you agree, or you can take a different
cosign?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay. Awesome. Well, while you're at it, check out, of course, Creative Kontrol, Vish's fabulous podcast. And thank you for doing that. It's awesome. And thank you for coming on. And thanks, everybody, for listening to Rock Docs.
He thought that we all lived in it together in a group house without any heat. Like we didn't eat. Is it true that they don't use heat?
The challenge is there, Can we throw down? Can we return that favor to people out there? And that's still something that feels very straight up to me. It just seems like I don't really. Oh yeah. To exist independent of the mainstream is a political feat, in my opinion.